I sat silent for a moment in shock that my plan had even worked. It seemed almost too simple, too easy. But here he was. Derek had a kindly face. Wrinkles around his eyes and cheeks only added to the softness of his expression. His white hair poking out from beneath his flat cap stood out in the dark night. "That's a lovely little patch you've planted. I can look after it if you like. I used to maintain the last garden here," he said, breaking the silence that had followed since his initial words. "I know who you are. We need you," was all I could manage. The mental exhaustion and fatigue from the whole experience had built up, but his arrival was like finishing a bad day working at school. I felt like I could relax again, even if only a little. "What's your name, darling?" he asked. "It's Kat. I live in flat 42 now." His face lit up as I confirmed my flat number. "Prudence is gone?" he asked. "She's gone, but the whole place is a mess. So many things are happening, and the residents are suffering," I answered. We chatted for what felt like hours, outside with nothing but moonlight. He told me how he used to consider the building part of the garden, a place for him to maintain, the residents just like the plants he looks after. I explained my whole experience since moving in. I told him about Jamie and I sobbed. Derek held me as I cried and made me feel safe, something I had forgotten the feeling of since receiving Prue's note. He didn't interrupt, he just listened. I told him about Natalia and the cultists, the problems they had been causing. He was particularly heartbroken when he heard that they had used Eddie and Ellie for entry. He had gone before they were born, but remembered Terry as a child and how sweet she was. He was pleased when I told her what a sweet adult she had become. My claims that Prudence was the only person who knew how to kill the imposter neighbors were met with a skeptical expression which gave me some hope. Derek listened to my entire tale with barely a word. When I finished, he stood up and asked me to follow him. I was confused, but I did as I was told. He walked me to the entrance of the lift. I lifted my arm to check the time on my watch. We had been outside for quite some time, and the idea of the creatures being inside made my heart pound and my stomach turn. "You are safe. It's 12:32 a.m. There's no need to worry or to check your watch." And with that, he pressed the call lift button. Despite his insistence that I was safe, my stomach continued to do gymnastics. It felt like forever before the lift finally made the clunking sound that meant it had reached the bottom. I felt my whole body shaking violently as the doors opened. I don't know what I expected to see. We were in the safe time zone, but every time I looked at the life, I pictured Jamie's dead, crunched up body. "Step inside," he said. "I can't. Please don't make me." I begged. "I won't let anything happen to you, but you need to see something." There was such sincerity in his eyes as he spoke. I had never trusted someone so completely, so quickly, but every fiber of my being told me this man was entirely good. I stepped inside the lift. Derek stepped in behind me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder as I hyperventilated. He gently turned me to face the panel of buttons that control where the lift stops. "What is wrong with this panel? Do you see it?" he asked cryptically. I studied the panel. Read all the numbers, counting them. I couldn't see anything wrong. I tried. I really tried, but nothing seemed out of place at all. Everything you expected to find was there, and nothing more. I shook my head, barely regaining my composure. "Can you take us to floor 9, please?" He smiled slightly as he made the request. I looked back to the panel to press the button, but floor 9 didn't exist. I was so confused. I had counted the numbers, I was sure of it. Derek must have made it disappear, but the panel didn't look any different to before. I can't explain it. Looking at it, I would have sworn blind nothing was wrong with it, even once I knew. But floor 9 didn't exist. Derek could see my frustration. It was like the building was now playing tricks on me. He walked me out of the lift and sat me down on the bottom of the stairs before he finally began to speak. "The building is like a living organism. It can seal off parts of the world, and it can open up others you never could have imagined. When those awful people burned that whole floor of residents, I was devastated. Some wonderful people lived in those flats, both of the usual and unusual variety. But those people had no limit to their cruelty. Whole families burned alive. It was a tragedy that made me so angry. I felt so guilty when it happened. I can predict what some of our more tricky residents are going to do and make sure I'm there to help. But those people were nothing to do with this place. I couldn't see what they were planning, so I couldn't stop it. At this point, I noticed one of the hairless cats had sat between us. Derek looked at it with tears brimming in his eyes. He stroked it, and it moved on to his lap. Derek's fingers didn't burn at all, he continued. When it happened, the building used its defense mechanisms and sealed off the entirety of the floor. It stopped the fire from spreading and kept the perpetrators there to die by their own hands. The building only allowed the floor to be unsealed once they were dead. It took about a week before those awful people turned up again. Asking for sugar at people's doors, the first few let them in. It was so difficult. So many residents burned alive that I was having to use their remains for my garden just to hide the dead. The entire community were terrified and grieving for those that died. No matter how hard I tried, I still couldn't predict them or see them. So I took Prudence, who at the time seemed a perfectly reasonable woman, to the burned-out floor. Floor 9, however, had been sealed again. There was no button in the lift, and it always skipped on the stairs. Only no one had noticed. This building really is a magnificent creature. I stared at him in amazement through the whole story. I was exhausted, but my brain was working in overdrive to process what he was telling me. I had started to stroke the cat too. My fingers did burn, but I didn't flinch. I found its company comforting. He carried on. I went back later that night and took the stairs again, alone this time. I think my intentions were clear, and the stairs allowed me access to floor 9 for the first time since just after the fire. I brought Prudence to the floor within the hour. The stairs had stopped skipping floor 9 for me, although I later learned that when Prudence had tried alone, she was not allowed access. We explored the floor, walking amongst the remnants of our dead friends' belongings. Eventually, we came across one of the soulless arsonists, roaming the halls. It appears that's where they spend their time when they aren't out terrorizing the residents trying to claim more victims. He was disturbed and disoriented to see anyone not like them on that floor. He twitched a little and spat out the sugar line as if it was an automatic response. I almost felt sorry for him. He claimed to come from flat 66. More were approaching behind him. Prudence was terrified. She was starting to sweat profusely and back away from the man, but it didn't cool her down. He was burning her slowly. I felt nothing. See, the stranger things in life just don't seem to affect me. I've never known why. Sometimes I even just know how to deal with them, like it's programmed into me. On this new playing field, in their domain, I knew what to do. I grabbed the man and ran him down to flat 66, 4 doors from where we were standing. I threw him into the flat and waited. The other arsonists were approaching. The man tried to exit the flat that was doorless after the wooden doors all burned to cinders in the fire. But as he reached the door, something stopped him. He couldn't leave, no matter how hard he tried or how much he screamed. Prudence lit up. She grabbed hold of one that had tried to kill her friend, Molly. She remembered the flat number she had claimed to be from and repeated my actions, with a lot more sweating and some winces of pain. It worked again. Prudence wanted to go after the rest, but as they got closer I could see the blisters forming on parts of her body. I dragged her out of the hallway and back into the stairwell. We ran. She begged me to take her back, kept telling me that the stairs wouldn't let her, that it was too dangerous. The residents had started to learn not to let them in, and we had no casualties at all after we trapped the first 2. Don't get me wrong, it's a problem I was intending to deal with. But it was around that time that we first learned the council would be building that monstrosity over the top of my garden. He gestured to the window that just showed some of the neighboring tower block. This left me not at my best. My intuition was failing me when a few months after that, I allowed Prudence and Molly to herd the creatures from the lift to floor 9. It's one of my biggest regrets. I should never have walked them up there. But I didn't know she was going to burn them all. She didn't give me a chance to reason. I became mistrusting of everyone and distracted, not long after I went away for a long while. So I guess the arsonists remained, and now they're threatening you. Tomorrow I will go. I will fix the mess I left behind. I am so sorry it's affected you so badly. I'd love to meet these twins. They sound incredibly brave. They are, I finally interrupted, and I want to be there tomorrow. I want to lock Natalia away for good. I can't allow it. You'll be attacked. He cut me off entirely. I let it drop instantly, but in the back of my mind I knew I would be there, no matter what. I went to sleep that night with my mind reeling. I wondered where Derek slept, and if he even needed to. The next morning I left my flat early, passed the man on floor 5, and waited on the steps at floor 8. I tested it, of course, and just like anticipated, ascending any higher took me straight to floor 10, or 11, depending on if you hit a skip. So I returned to floor 8, and I waited. Derek hadn't indicated what time he was coming, but I was ready. I would wait all day and night if I had to, but luckily I didn't. Derek was climbing the stairs at around 11 a.m. I had already been there for 3 hours, but it had been worth it. He looked particularly unimpressed to see me. His face still looked kind though, even with the sour expression. "I can't stop you, can I?" he sighed, sounding resigned in his tone. "Not for anything. You have to promise to stay back. If you get your girl approaches, you can do what you need to do, but you have to stay back," he pleaded. I nodded and stood up. We ascended the stairs, and for the very first time in my new life here, I saw the big plastic sign saying 9, the floor that didn't exist. As we pushed through the door, it was like entering an entirely new world. Everything was black, burned to carbon. You could smell nothing but charcoal. Literally nothing but empty shells of homes, and flakes of what used to be sentimental objects remained. It was devastating to witness. If you've ever visited a mass gravesite, you'll understand partly how I was feeling. It was sickening to think of all the lives needlessly lost. But I didn't get time to think. Natalia walked towards me, flying down the hallway. "How the fuck did you get here?" she screamed. Her eyes were wide and angry. I started to feel hotter already. Derek grabbed my arm and pulled me next to him, making sure to keep a tight hold of my arm. "Where do you live?" Derek asked her. I started to back away as the sweat dropped from my brow. I desperately wanted to shout out the number, but I couldn't. I was so hot, I wasn't functioning properly. Everything became so overwhelming I couldn't remember what Georgia had said, what flat Natalia had claimed to come from. "I'm not that stupid. I saw what happened to them." She gestured over her shoulder to what must have been flat number 66, where a man laid on the floor, breathing but looking broken, just existing in that room. Prudence had been creative with the truth yet again. She didn't kill them. You can't kill them. What had Georgia said? I racked my brains as I felt the skin on my face start to sting. I imagined her melting away. It was happening to me. I was next. And then, as my hair started to singe at the ends, it came to me. 71, I screamed as loud as I could. I could barely see as Derek grabbed her and ran towards me with her. She was clawing at his eyes and face, screaming at him to let go. But he didn't burn. He just kept hold of her. When he approached flat 71, he beckoned me over. "You do it, then get off of this floor." He was blunt but reasonable, I complied. I pushed hard. There was nothing but anger in her eyes. She pushed my face hard with her hand as I got her to cross the boundary into flat 71. I felt my skin sizzle and blister. My whole face was in agony, but I didn't stop pushing. Watching Natalia try to fight her way out of a door that didn't exist was both satisfying and humorous. The others had started to approach at the sound of the commotion. I lingered, hoping to watch her suffer, but Derek shot me one look, and I knew. It was time to go. I ran out the corridor and back into the stairwell. I stopped for longer than I probably should have, but I knew I might not get to see that 9 again, and it would be worth it. I waited for Derek on floor 9's stairwell. I couldn't help but imagine the cultists burning to death the first time around. I could hear angry screams faintly from inside the corridor. They made me worry about Derek, but I knew that really I didn't need to. It took a while, but he eventually left the corridor and joined me in the stairwell. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and the third-degree burns across my face. He didn't need to speak. I knew he'd fix the problem. We walked silently back down the stairs towards my flat. I looked back up at floor 9, knowing the building would seal it off for good. It took a few floors to reach floor 7, and I invited Derek in for a cup of tea. He rejected it, saying he wanted to go visit some old friends. Despite my injuries, I couldn't help but smile. Something I'd done was going to help these residents. I stood at my door and watched Derek walk away, pleased that there was some true good in this building. After a few steps down the hallway, Derek started to fade, almost like a CGI ghost in a movie. Every step he became more transparent. I felt my stomach turn again, like it had outside the lift. I ran out to follow him. I called after him, but by the time I had reached where he'd been, he was gone. I walked the entire corridor to the window at the back. I looked out the window into the small, concrete-heavy garden and hoped to see him sat on the memorial bench. I didn't see him. Instead, I saw Prudence, hacking at my tiny planted patch with shears. When I saw her out the window, garden shears being gripped by both hands and a maniacal expression on her face, I just stood still. I was frozen to the spot in shock. I felt no pain at all from the burn on my face. Everything was numb. The relief of eradicating the imposter neighbors and the joy at finding a friend in Derek was hacked away in an instant, just like every leaf from my shrubs. Why would she do this? What had I ever done to her? Every question possible crossed my mind. I could feel the frustration bubbling inside me. Everything about this place just threw up question after question, and for every answer I got, there were 10 new questions waiting to be asked. At that moment in time, though, only one was truly important. How did Prudence know? I thought about Terry and her telephone conversations. I didn't want to think that the sweet lady I thought Terry had turned out to be would do that, but it did cross my mind. I thought of Ian the postman. I'd had bad vibes from him for a while. Maybe he'd seen Derek coming up the stairs while on his rounds that morning. I stood there frozen, pondering all these things until I saw Prudence collapse onto the memorial bench, sobbing, head in her hands. She was surrounded by the remains of my attempt at a garden with the shears laid out on the floor. The stairs were kind to me on the way down. It took 4 flights to make it to the bottom. I ran down the corridor and out the back entrance of the block, no idea what I was going to say. Prudence was all I could manage. Nice one, Cat. She sat bolt upright before turning and standing quicker than I thought it possible for an old lady. You evil, stupid little girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? She screamed, so much animation in her face that the spaces between her wrinkles pulsated like veins on an angry weightlifter. Me? You think I'm evil? You left that shitty note hidden, missing everything I need to know, and got my boyfriend killed. And what you're doing to your own. I screamed, tears beginning to roll, before she interrupted me. Don't you dare talk about her. Her voice cracked, and she broke down again, this time falling to her knees, twigs and leaves sticking to the bottom of her dress. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat down on the floor. I knew that it was probably a bad idea. This woman couldn't be trusted, and I hadn't forgotten that. But seeing an old lady crying on the cement floor still made me feel awful. How did you know about the garden? I asked her calmly, trying to change my approach. She shoved a crumpled up piece of paper into my hand. She didn't look at me. Her eyes remained on the floor. Dear Prudence, I couldn't exist knowing what I'd done. I should never have told you about it. The last 2 won't grow stronger. She was never theirs to begin with. But I have to end her suffering. I'm sorry. Derek. I knew what he had done as soon as I finished the note. Lila, or what was left of her, was gone for good. Of all the creatures, only Jamie's killers from the lift remained. That's how Derek had spent the few hours I'd slept between our encounters. This is all your fault, she sniffed. My whole family are gone because of you. That hurt a lot. I trembled as I tried to speak, but I always really hated confrontation, and I could feel myself starting to glitch. How can you say that? I saw her, and she was trapped in a tiny cage eating dog food and small animals. Your family died in that lift, just like my Jamie. I may have struggled to get my words out, but I wasn't about to let Prudence Hemmings blame me for her decisions. Lila was better off dead than what she was, however awful that may sound. What happened to your face? Prudence growled at me. Take you to visit floor number 9? He did this to her in the first place, not me, and now he's disfigured you. She was spinning things. I could feel throbbing as she mentioned my face. I really should have had medical attention. This isn't his fault. You messed him up, and he did that to her because of you. You told me that yourself. I tried ferociously to defend Derek, but something inside me still felt uncomfortable about what he had done. I couldn't help it. Lila was an innocent little girl who shouldn't have been punished for Prue's mistakes. This whole thing was such a mess. I was grieving, and then I had her back for all those years, and then I lost Bernie, and then my home, and now I have to grieve for her all over again. Prudence continued to cry, but softer. I looked around at the chaos she created, and up at the block my boyfriend had died in, and rolled my eyes in disbelief that she could be so selfish. She continued, "Let me tell you about Lila. She was a beautiful little girl. As I mentioned before, I have 2 other older children. They've had many other grandchildren. However, I hadn't spoken to my eldest 2 in years even before what happened with Lila. Lila was my first opportunity to get to know one of my grandchildren. Bernie adored her too, always reading her stories and sneaking her sweets. I begged my son to allow her to stay. My children were all incredibly ungrateful. They had it easy growing up and still resented me. I gave them a good, strict upbringing, but they didn't appreciate it. They said I was a cruel mother. Lila's dad was the only one I spoke to, but our relationship still wasn't that of a typical loving mother and son. But she was a second chance. It was a miracle when he agreed. I was more shocked he'd convinced his wife to allow it. That awful harlot of a woman never liked me, although I didn't like her either. They refused to speak to me after everything. I haven't heard from them since. They had more grandchildren I'll never meet. I knew at the time my relationships with any of my children were over for good. So when Derek gave me a solution, I took it. I wasn't entirely truthful when we first spoke. I said I hadn't wanted this, but I was desperate. There was never a way to bring her back safely. Derek explained what she would become to me. He was initially trying to put me off, even trying to get her back. I knew exactly what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't pass up the idea of my beautiful little Lila needing her grandma forever. I suppose I was too ashamed to admit it before. But why should I be ashamed? My altercation with Derek happened after she was back, when he tried to kill her the first time. Spouting the same things on that note, what kind of monster wants to kill a little girl? That's why I trashed the garden. He said he wasn't coping with the news of the new block when he suggested it, that he shouldn't have told me it was even possible, and she had to die. I hid her until the bulldozers came in. When he disappeared, I thought I was safe to spend the rest of my life with her. Bernie hated me. Spending time with Lila was all I lived for. I grew to love her how she was. I felt sick. Listening to Prudence talk brought up so many repressed feelings about Jamie. I hadn't had time to grieve or process anything. I missed him terribly. My old life and my old future felt a million miles away. I was relieved to know that Derek hadn't tricked Prudence, or even intended to create Rat Lila. He was truly good. But she didn't get to have a life. You lived for her, but she wasn't really living. How could a sane person do that to their own flesh and blood? I retorted. You have no idea. This place can make you do irrational things. But she had a life. She had me. It's all she needed. She was certainly right about the building and irrational actions. The pain intensifying on my face throbbed in agreement. But I was still convinced she had lost it Dr. Frankenstein style where Rat Lila was concerned. She had stopped crying. Her rage levels were rising again. I tried to tell her that it wasn't really the child she'd known, but she seemed to have grown an entirely new attachment to the creature that replaced what she lost. Every rational argument I gave was met with increasing levels of screaming. She got less coherent as she went on. The argument was going nowhere. We went back and forth for what felt like forever. After a while, she started to get closer to me. We had both stood up by this point, and despite her haggard and frail appearance, Prudence was truly frightening. She looked unhinged. Her words were no longer going in. I was overwhelmed and had too many thoughts rushing through my mind to process her ranting. I took a few steps back, clearing a small distance between us. By this point, out of the corner of my eye, I could see neighbors in windows of the block, watching the altercation outside. Prue's screaming had brought a lot of attention. It was bright, and I couldn't see well, but I turned to scan the windows and did recognize Eddie and Ellie watching from their bedroom, trying to wave at me. They frantically waved and pointed. I tried waving back and gesturing to them, but they kept pointing at me. Why were they pointing? And then I heard it, the garden shears scraping against the ground as Prudence picked them up and charged towards me. "You ignorant little bitch! You aren't even listening! You don't deserve my home! You killed her!" The twins had been telling me to turn around. I shouldn't have taken my eyes off her. Luckily, unlike my earlier shock when I had first seen her, I didn't freeze. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I ran faster than I ever have before. I burst back into the building and heard neighbors on the bottom floor lock their doors in a symphony of bolts clicking. I couldn't blame them. Prudence wasn't far behind me, and I wouldn't want to take her on in her current state if given a choice. But it didn't stop me pounding on their doors, begging someone to call the police, although something told me that in this building that wasn't going to happen. I ran up the stairs, still being followed by her. By the second floor, most were still locked, but a few had come out of their homes, armed with a variety of heavy objects. Even in a crisis, I couldn't fault the community spirit here. I ran another flight of stairs that became 2, but still lead me to floor 3 and then to the back of the corridor. I pounded on Terry's door. My heart was racing, but when I turned, Prue was nowhere to be seen. I was hoping the people who came out on floor 2 had stopped her, but something was odd. I hadn't heard any commotion. This wasn't the end of it. Eddie and Ellie hugged me tight as Terry let me in and bolted the door shut quickly behind me. I told her about what had happened. She couldn't believe what Prue had done. It turned out no one knew about Lila. I was edgy for the first hour, but Prue had disappeared. Terry helped to clean up my burn and put some cold compress on it. She offered to take me to the hospital, but I couldn't. I was too shaken up from what had just happened. I couldn't face trying to explain how I'd sustained my injuries, and I still hadn't reported Jamie missing. He still hadn't had any messages from his family, and work had given up calling, but his friends had started. They were harassing me non-stop, but I had been too distracted to come up with a decent lie. It had been a week since I moved in, and it wouldn't be long until people realized something was seriously wrong. My conversations with my family had been short, with me insisting they didn't visit until we were unpacked and set up. On top of a murderous old lady and an untold amount of abnormal issues, the real-world problems were starting to creep up on me. I sat with Terry for hours, drinking tea and chatting to her. It started to get dark, and Eddie and Ellie came into the living room after playing in their room for a while. The voids replaced the big brown puppy dog eyes again, and their claws looked especially sharp. But to me they were still adorable. Their transformation prompted me to head back to my flat. It was late. I needed to work out what to do next and how to dig myself out of this giant hole. I couldn't just keep planting gardens. I needed to do this myself. I wandered up the stairs. They went on for a while, but nothing too horrific. I passed the man on floor 5, nodding politely and continuing my ascent. I wondered if he'd received the letter of concern yet. He was a little unsettling. When I got to my floor, Mr. Prentice was making his animal noises again. I smiled, which hurt my face. After all the madness, I was starting to find the seemingly benign horrors of this building oddly comforting. I reached my flat and turned the key in the door before bolting myself in like Terry had. I could feel something wasn't right the moment I entered. The flat was in chaos, which was nothing new because we had only moved in a week ago and I had been too preoccupied to unpack. But things were out of place. The organized chaos wasn't how I'd left it. Then she strolled out of my kitchen, Prudence Hemmings. She was carrying a large carving knife in her left hand this time. She had prepared for her attack. She smiled at me and lifted her right hand, jingling a set of keys that she had entered with. I turned to unbolt the door, but she grabbed me from behind before I could turn the handle to open it and held the knife to my throat. "I will kill you for what you've done," she whispered into my ear. Without a second thought, I leaned forward just a tad and swung my head back as hard as I could. I couldn't believe that it worked, but I must have broken her nose. Prudence dropped the knife and clutched her face, blood streaming between her fingers. I went to grab the knife, but she was closer and doing the same thing. I had no other option but to run again. I grabbed the door handle and turned it to exit the flat as she tried to stab me. I was mostly out the door, but her arm was close enough to reach my side, and I felt the knife pierce the side of my torso. I was in searing pain, but I didn't stop running. As I stepped outside my flat, I could still hear Mr. Prentice's noises flooding the entire hallway. It gave me an idea. I ran towards his door, Prudence stabbing at me frantically with blood gushing from her nose. A few got me as I stopped outside flat 48. The pain was awful, and I could feel myself starting to drift out of consciousness. I was losing a lot of blood. I would give my last breath to end Prue. So running on nothing but adrenaline, I knocked hard on flat 48 and shouted, "Mr. Prentice, can you help me?" It was a shot in the dark. I didn't know what would happen, but I had to try something. She had stopped stabbing at me. She was enjoying watching me bleed out slowly from the wounds she had already inflicted. I was incredibly weak, and I lost consciousness not long after that. But before I did, I heard heavy clunking from the inside of flat 48, chain locks being released and bolts being undone. I watched with blurry vision as a large creature, that I can only describe as a cross between a bull and a wolf, charged out of the flat and trampled the old witch to death. I heard her bones crunch just as slipped away. I woke up in the hospital a day later. My parents were there, as were the police. Apparently, I had been found just outside the tower block with my handbag missing, by a neighbor who had been watching from a window as it happened. The police told me that the person had seen the mugging out of their window. They had seen two men approach me and Jamie, splash something in my face, attack us, and when he tried to fight back, they bundled my boyfriend into a car, which the police had been searching for to no avail. He was officially missing. I was baffled but grateful that Jamie's disappearance wouldn't be blamed on me. I went along with it and made out that he had ghosted work to enjoy our first week living together. I had been stabbed 4 times, but thankfully in all the right places, if there is such a thing as the right place to be stabbed. I lost a lot of blood, but I was going to be fine. They were all shallow. They assumed my burns were chemical and happened during the mugging too. The police promised to keep us updated, but they still can't find the car. They never will. I wish the story the police had been told were true. It left some hope for Jamie. My parents weren't keen on me returning to the flat after what happened. They said the area was too rough and that I was living proof it wasn't safe. They offered to collect my stuff for me. I insisted though, told them that I wanted to see how I felt, and they couldn't force me not to. I was released from the hospital 2 days after I woke up in there. When I arrived at the flats, it was strange. It felt like home. Despite everything, something about this place drew me to it. I took the lift for the first time since Jamie had died. I had to. I wasn't recovered enough to conquer too many stairs just yet, and I couldn't guarantee they'd be kind to me. I smiled at the lack of a button 9 and winced at the thought of the creatures. As I reached my corridor, I saw Mr. Prentice walking along with his newspaper and milk in a bag. He turned to me and smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd come back. It's nice to see you're up and walking." He made small talk, as if I hadn't seen him literally trample a woman to death a couple of days prior. The whole experience had been so disorienting that I started to wonder if I really had been mugged and had dreamed the note and everything that's happened since. Then he said something that confirmed everything was real. "I never liked that woman, but you've got a real friend in the lady downstairs." He winked at me and turned the key in his door. I got into mine and sat down on the second-hand sofa. I felt empty but relieved. With Prue and the imposter neighbors all gone, the only threat left were the creatures in the lift, who were only a threat between 111 and 333. Maybe I could start to live a semi-peaceful life in this place. Terry knocked on the door, my handbag, that I had left at hers before Prue attacked in my flat, on her arm. Mr. Prentice was right. She was a good friend. I thanked her for what she'd done and for what she'd told the police. She said it was pure luck that she found me. She had been walking up to return the bag and found me and Prue sprawled out on the floor. I asked what happened to Prue's body, and she just pointed in the direction of flat 48. He was eating it. she said. It's been a few days now and I've decided to stay. I can't imagine going back to complete normality after everything I've been through, and I've grown quite attached to some of the building's quirks. I tried replanting the garden with the help of the twins. I ripped a few stitches doing it and Derek never came. I think he's gone for good. I'm ready to fully embrace life here. The last few days have been hard, but there's some time to breathe. Along with the time to breathe came the time to grieve, and I've been grieving badly for Jamie. This leads me to the last thing I have to tell you. Last night I laid in bed, plagued with thoughts of Prue and everything that had happened, but what I couldn't get to leave my mind was how much happiness it bought her to have Lila back. It infected every part of my thoughts. I know you all warned me not to, but I did it. I repeated the ritual. I haven't caught him yet, but I've heard the scratching. Jamie's back.